Hey guys, I'm Yegi Shatini, and today we're going to go over the boss fight music implementation I did in our game Chroma that you could download on Steam. Now, this is only going through the boss fight music. We did the Wise integration last time, which showed how we use switch containers to do phase changing, but today we're just going to do it solely inside of Metasounds. Now, the key thing here, again, we're going to have boss phases. In this example, we're just going to go from phase 1 to 2 to 3. We're not going to worry about cycling back or randomly switching phases, but all of that is pretty easily doable, and I'll kind of show you that inside the blueprints. And then, like I mentioned before, there are tons of ways to implement all of these systems, so if you would do it differently, let me know. The core thing, especially when working inside of Metasounds, Wise kind of functions like a DAW, so without having that, it's really important to know how you're exporting audio from your DAW into Unreal Engine. So in our case, I'm just dealing with the audio how I took from the last Wise video. Again, as far as we're concerned, we're doing just boss hitting health thresholds, that kind of example, and the boss can't heal, so going from phase 1 into phase 2 into phase 3. So let's go in Engine. Let's take a listen real quick, starting from the beginning. So we're just starting off with, simple phase 1 music. Once we take it down enough health, trigger phase 2. If you're tracking the tempo and the beat, you'll see it doesn't switch. And then trigger to phase 3. Alright, so let's take a look at what we're doing here. Now, the very first time I tried implementing this, you'll notice this is red commented. We're not using this one. But I wanted to basically do it exactly like I did in Wise, where you'd get a new trigger from the game itself, starting the audio. The problem with doing it this way I was finding was, say we trigger phase 2, and I'll kind of play. Right, it's just going to stack and play each other. Sorry if that was kind of loud. I didn't lower the volume on this blueprint. But yeah, the issue there is like you would have to stop the first trigger, which wouldn't be too bad, right? Like you could put a stop call here and then deal with using that quantized and maybe quantizing it to the bar and kind of counting to track where in the phrase you are. But that was starting to feel like a lot of work for starting and stopping audio in time. Now with Quartz, you can easily do that by subscribing to the bar, but again, that was a little much. So I stopped thinking of dealing it that way, and then I went on to kind of what I ended up using here. So we have our 3 phases: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. They are all playing at the same time. You'll notice we have, just like they all have the standard on play trigger. The difference is we're just changing the overall levels of what you hear. So doing it this way lets you keep everything in time and effectively guarantees that it's not going to go out of time. And since it's also similar, we're not having to worry about any intricate changing or any weird time signature shifts. Everything here I think is in 176 BPM, all the exports. I know phase 1 and phase 2 are all the same song. Phase 3 is by the same artist, just in a different key, but still the same tempo. So if this patch is similar to the last patch, it's again just the input, nothing special here, just getting your different stems. I mentioned before in the last video that in hindsight, well, not really in hindsight because I just took the audio as I had it, but if I were to do this from scratch, I would just put everything in one file. I wouldn't separate the drums and the bass, and then from here you would just do a random get, maybe make 6 or 7 variations or something, and then put them in an array to just pull a total stem, instead of having to deal with importing the drums, the bass, the vocals, or the synths and everything separately. So that would be a lot cleaner way to do it. But instead of that, since I had the stems separated, I just made this quick little patch to put them all in one node. So For phase one, this is almost identical to what we did in the normal levels. So in the last set of videos I have, this is just going into a trigger repeat, repeating a sequence to play part A, and then it would go into a coin flip 50-50, either play part B or part C. Then it would go back to A, and then 50-50 B or C, and so on. I have a sequence 3 here just because part A is 32 bars, and then B and C are both 16. So having a blank second sequence just makes it so that when my trigger repeat happens, it's still just playing the second half of A and not actually triggering anything. For phase 2 and 3, these are all, I didn't have a B or C section for these, but it would ultimately look the same as you did for phase 1 and however many parts you have here. There's an extra mixer here, and this was just for volume control because I noticed when recording it was kind of loud, so this wouldn't be here in the actual implementation. This is just for the sake of me recording. So the actual stuff is really happening here because, again, the issue with doing separate triggers and calling a completely separate event, like putting a new input here, was that getting it to play at the right time without skipping beats or being kind of like this rough transition was a lot more work. And it was still kind of stuttering. I was finding like you'd have to be very accurate to get it to be consistent, and it was proving to be a lot more than it needed to be. So this is a lot simpler. Really, our blueprint, which we'll look at in a second for the level blueprint, is just controlling this volume, and it's either setting it to 1 to play it or setting it to 0 to mute it. All right, so we start off with phase 1 completely loud, and that's what we hear. Phase 2 and 3 are muted. When we switch to phase 2, phase 1 will be set to 0, phase 2 would be set to 1, and then, so on. I just have a 3-second interpolation there just so it's not an instant cutoff. This gives it a little time to actually fade out or fade in. So it's still keeping it in time. It's just making it less harsh of a cutoff. You could play around with that timing. I found 3 to be fine. You could also use a audio bus. The reason I wanted interpolation is, again, to make it a little smoother of a crossfade, but also when we switch to the phases, our boss just plays a roar, and we want to make sure we hear that. That plays alongside an animation, so you could put this in a bus and then make sure when this plays, everything else ducks a little bit. But just having the fade in and out just makes it a lot smoother and prettier to listen to. All right. Now, as far as where controlling it, I'm just using the simple widget blueprint. I just click the buttons, but this would be effectively simulating where your boss health would be when it hits the threshold, or say you might have it in a timer, whatever your form of implementation is. But as far as a level blueprint, right, how we're actually triggering the Metasound to play and triggering these phases to switch volumes. You'll notice this one looks a lot smaller than my last one. This is because I didn't set up a chord system on this. I just didn't need to for the sake of this demo, but if this were the real project, like the last video I showed, you would have your chord system and do all that. But I didn't need to subscribe to anything, and I wasn't worrying about keeping stuff in time because we're playing it all at once. So it's just going to be in time anyway. So here I'm just adding the widget to the blueprint. This is for the sake of the demo, so you can see what's happening. And then I have my 2 buttons that are just bind to on click. This would, again, be an event that's tied to your boss health or boss timer, or whatever you have going on. In our case, this would be the health. All right, so once we trigger phase 2, I'm just playing my roar and then setting the phase 1 volume to 0. I added a delay here just because I wasn't hearing the roar as much as I wanted. With the 3-second fade out, this delay was fine. Again, I would play around with these in the final product, make sure nothing got lost in the mix with all the other sound effects happening. And then since this is phase 2, I was adding phase 2 volume to 1. And then we do the same thing for phase 3, set phase 2 to 0, phase 3 to 1. If you were able to go back to, say, phase 1, or it was constantly cycling, you would just need to add another kind of check here. Make sure your floats you're setting every other phase to 0, and then the one that you're currently in would be set to 1. But again, for us, we're just going from 1, 2 to 3, so I don't have to worry about kind of making a group of in names. Say you had 5 phases, you could have multiple inside of just one node, and you wouldn't have to connect them here, just like make an array of names. But yeah, that was really it with this final boss music. Once you did the normal implementation, like once you understood doing this part, however you needed to do that with your audio, for me, again, I have my stems all together. I just made a patch for it and then figured out how I wanted to flip it. I didn't care too much about which part played. Like there wasn't any specific, like I need A to play first and then B. In this case, I used the sequence. A would always be first, but I could have used a filter for all of these to just trigger them randomly. But once you have this set, really it's going to be the same for your phase 2 and phase 3. You just have to, fill that out as much as you want. And then the rest of it's just being controlled by the volume gain input, and then just interpolating that so it's not an instant switch, right? It has some time to crossfade between the parts. But if you know all your pieces are in the same BPM, then you could do that easily doing it this way. If they weren't the same beat, which I guess, you could do if that's what you wanted, this would still play. It would just you'd have to find a way to make sure that when you crossfade between them, it's not too jarring to flip. But in that case, I might actually want to stop one first and then maybe play some transitioning audio. But this works well, that considering they're all in the same key and they're all in the same tempo. So that's it for the boss fight implementation of the background music. If you have any questions, then feel free to ask below, but I'll see you next time.